smart discussion that we have before summer. You can go on with the other picture. So, Martin, for you to know, this is since the beginning of the pandemics, we decided a group of people to organize with a regular basis what we call smart discussions. The idea is to share ideas between us with some people that are specialized in some topics, trying to find the solutions and other comments for the future. We have lots of people during these 2 years, especially from economics, but also from other areas. And for us, it's an honor to be here today with you, because as I told you, most of the people that are here read you and have a very strong admiration for your work and your comment. So today we have Martin with us. Martin is, as you know, an associate editor and chief economics of Financial Times. He writes a lot on this very famous newspaper. And of course, it's one of the most world recognized commentators in economics. And of course, it's a pleasure to have you with us. He wrote an article some weeks ago that was distributed to all of you. Can you show please the title of the article? The article, in my opinion, is a very interesting point of the situation of the world, what we could say a state of the world, where it tries to summarize 12 points that in his idea are very important for the future of the world. So for this session, the idea was that Martin would speak a little bit in the beginning, trying to summarize the idea of the article, and then we could have a chat between all of us. So I have some people that I already invited to make some questions, but of course, other people can also make some questions within the time that you have. Martin, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to the discussion. I will make a very brief introduction. I think that the 12 points can be boiled down a bit, at least some of the major points, in 3 different directions. And I'll just touch on these. The first point, which is actually, I think, the second, is that we are now living in a world very different from what we thought after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was a world in which economic policy and economic prospects were the dominant feature of policy making, and there was a pretty broad consensus across the world on what those policies should look like. And in particular, it was about markets and globalization and economic integration. And I think that could be perhaps summarized in James Carville's famous sentence in 1992, "It's the economy, stupid." And I think we are very, very clearly, it's completely obvious in an era where the opposite is true. It's the politics, stupid. And this is politics dominates economics domestically and also globally. Of course, economics is part of politics, very profoundly so, but you can't look at it or address what's happening in predominantly economic terms. The second big set of points are about how the world economy is itself being changed and our societies are being changed by ongoing technological and associated economic transformations, which are dominated, I think, in particular still by communications technology, also, I think, to a lesser degree, by life sciences, but I won't touch that. And we are getting into a very troubled relationship with the global technological transformation, with a lot of backlash about what it's done to our societies, to our businesses, to who dominates the world. So it's there, and it's clearly ongoing. We don't control it, but we don't really like it. And the third sort of theme that runs through this is, I think, linked to the other two, though it goes beyond that, which is geopolitics. It's pretty obvious that economic change and technological change have transformed domestic politics in very stressful directions. You only need to look at recent election results. You look at Brexit, things like that. But I think something more important is happening, which is a new era of intense geopolitical rivalry and conflict, with the emergence of China, of course, as a superpower, but perhaps more immediately the rapid emergence of a intense rivalry across the board between the United States and the West to some degree as well, and China. For the first time, we have a superpower which is non-Western, definitively non-democratic, and in many ways, though far from all, is a genuine rival of the West dominant power. And this is a transformative event. And we're only beginning, I think, to understand how transformative it is. And of course, right at the moment, that's linked to the event that is most immediately critical to Europe and to the world economy more recently, which is the war in Ukraine. I don't know, obviously, but I wonder whether Mr. Putin would have dared to start it if he didn't have the implicit and to some degree unknown explicit backing of China. And it is clearly an event, this war, that is reshaping the world's economic and political map, including the European economic and political map, and is bringing home this theme of geopolitics more profoundly. I could talk about many of the other issues. I could go through them all, but I think that's a reasonable introduction to some of the themes in this article, and I'm happy to discuss any.
Yes, I have one or two questions, but I will put it in the end, so I will invite some people to make some questions. Anyone that wants to make a question is free putting that in the chat, and then I will ask two questions. But I will ask Pedro Passos Coelho, that is here with us, if he wants to make some comment or some question to Martin concerning the article, and then I will pass to other people.
Well, very briefly, I think you are very right. It's always the politics, we can say, because even when economics were the first discussion issue around the world, that would represent a situation where politics failed. And now we have the conscience that politics may be essential to not follow again in a situation where economics can have again the first place in the living standards of people around the world. So I think that the rivalry among the West and the new Asian superpower is quite important. But I would like to focus our attention in Europe. And so I will do two considerations and a question to Martin Wolf. First consideration, we accumulated since the beginning of the Great Recession lots of resentment and also lots of debt in Europe. Of course, the fight against pandemics raised all over the world the proportion of debt countries. But in Europe, the great divide between the north and the southern countries is now deeper because the same countries, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, are now lots of debt that cannot be easily managed in the new time where monetary policy must address the inflation threat. So it's more difficult to expect ECB to help troubled countries if the market thinks that ECB would not be credible managing the spreads of the sovereign debt of these countries. That's the first consideration. So we are again in the eve of something difficult to manage in terms of political choice. And that's the second consideration. No one's suspect that the ECB has not the power to solve the problems. It can address the two situations, the two targets. It can fight against inflation, raising the yield, the interest rates, and it can also manage expectations about the spreads in the market. But for that, you must have a consensus, a political consensus inside to put the necessary mechanism working. And it's possible that markets suspect that this consensus is not easy to afford. For instance, everyone knew that when the ECB could communicate the new time of interest rates, the impact on sovereign debt could damage the markets. But even so, the ECB reacted in a very nervous way. So he was not prepared for answer to a question that everyone knew that will come up when the decision, the new situation would be communicated. So if the markets suspect that the ECB, contrary to 2012, when Draghi communicate a mechanism to solve the problem, if the markets suspect that a mechanism like that is not affordable in the internal consensus, maybe we can have a problem. Nowadays, the interest rates in the secondary market are not so bad as we could expect, but they are expecting the reaction of the ECB. So I would ask to Martin Wolf first, can we have, in your opinion, a situation where the consensus, the political consensus, despite the war in the Ukraine that came together in a strongest way, the West and NATO and European Union, can this situation create a stronger divide inside the ECB and inside the European Union? And second, if a situation like that would occur, do you think that the European countries finally can face stepping up political solution among the different countries, putting away the differences that we can see and identify since the beginning of the European Union history, and finally manage a different solution for monetary integration, economic integration, and political integration? Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm sorry,
Martin, do you want to answer? And then we have other questions. Okay, please.
I'll try to do this quickly. I mean, your observations are obviously correct, and the questions you pose are burning ones. And the answer, of course, is to your questions is I don't know. And I don't know for a pretty obvious reason. I have always been a very strong supporter of the existence of the European Union. And I was deeply upset when Britain decided to leave. But I also have consistently been of the view that at the very least, the currency union was a heroic gamble. And it's for the reasons you've outlined, which is it is evident that enormous tensions are built into a situation when you share a monetary institution with other countries, which are politically and fiscally fundamentally sovereign. Still, as you say, as you indicated, much of the time this doesn't matter, but there are situations in which it matters. And when it matters to the point of nearly existential crisis. Last time, this was resolved because, luckily, the crisis occurred at a time in which the right monetary policy for the Eurozone was also, by and large, the right monetary policy to help the crisis-hit countries. So once the ECB had worked out that that was true and had a central banker in charge who understood that was true, the problem was resolved. I was reasonably aware of this before, and I wrote actually one of the cheekiest things I ever did. I wrote an open letter to Mario Draghi in 2011 on his appointment, in which I laid out what I thought had to be done. These were not my ideas. They were pretty obvious in the literature. And actually, it's what he did. Now, the situation now is potentially much more difficult because the central bank has to tighten monetary policy. How much it has to tighten is, I think, an important discussion. Not as much as America or Britain, but still, I think, somewhat. At a time when the fundamental divergences between countries in terms of debt levels, external competitiveness, and so forth still exist. And markets will naturally start testing those divergences when an open-ended commitment from the ECB to eliminate spreads is much less credible than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. And I honestly don't know what they will do. I think a situation in which the ECB effectively writes a blank check to member governments in this situation is not going to hold. Therefore, some other arrangement has to be found. The arrangement that they articulated, the outright monetary transactions arrangement, involves conditionality which I don't think will be politically acceptable.
And strong
certainly not in Italy. I'm not going to talk about your own country. I know Italy better, and obviously it's bigger, so it will matter even more. And the alternative would be an enormously enhanced fiscal stability mechanism of some kind, which will mean somebody has to put up a very large amount of money, either in practice or at least in as a backup to these operations. And that requires a very substantially enhanced degree of fiscal and so political integration. We've all known this, and we all know that a crisis will at some time occur, bound to occur, in which either this is what happens or, in my view, an insoluble crisis emerges. The people who created this were mostly aware of this, but they made the wrong decisions. The Germans were the ones who were right, by the way. We often criticize them, but back in the early 90s, they were the ones who said we needed political unification, political union, and they offered it. Whether it would have happened, I don't know, probably not, but it was offered. And the people who rejected it were the French, for reasons that you will all understand and know. And so we ended up with this strange combination of sovereign nations with a integrated monetary system. And I remain anxious, and we'll have to see whether it will happen. And it will ultimately depend on a very few governments, whether they are prepared to make this huge leap. In the current circumstances, maybe the chances are better because the political necessity of unification and union is greater. But honestly, I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Martin, thank you very much. Now I ask Denise that is here with us. She's very specialist in the national brands and what it's important in terms of brands. I don't know, Denise, if you want to make some question to Martin. If it is possible to be brief, because we have other people. Okay.
I would love to make a question, but first I would like to hear Martin answering the questions that were asked, because maybe he'll answer one of my questions. And I have two questions for him. One is connected to the China emerging power, emerging economic power that can overwhelm the political European Western power. How can it be rebalanced? But maybe the other questions will answer this one. And the other question is more focused on Portugal and this whole scenario. So maybe I'll leave my questions to the end.
Okay. When you say I should answer the questions, you mean the questions in the chat?
Yes, the questions in the chat.
Okay.
Or other questions. But I would like to have these two questions answered, but I can explain them better later on. Because I believe that your answer to the questions that are in the chat will answer partially to mine. So maybe I'll have to detail my questions a little bit more.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, Martin, it's okay to you?
I'm perfectly happy to look at to answer the questions in the chat, which I've looked at, both of which are utterly fascinating. So this is my current perspective on the impact of sanctions on Russia. There are two time horizons here, or at least that is what I will be told. I believe that in the short to medium term, which is certainly up to now, and I think for many more months and possibly years, the impact of the situation overall, including the sanctions, is not significantly to harm the Russian economy or its ability to fight this war. In particular, and crucially, the impact of the crisis has been overall to increase its export receipts very substantially because of the impact on its principal exports. It's knocked out one of the competitors in food, Ukraine, and of course, the markets in oil have been significantly tightened, and the price of gas has gone up. Now, how much that will benefit depends on how much gas it will end up delivering. That's a very complicated issue. But if you look at the Russian balance of payment overall, it's pretty obvious that it's in a perfectly comfortable situation. So it can sustain the war. Now, there is an argument that in the longer run, there will be two forms of damage to Russia, one which is militarily relevant. And the one that is militarily relevant, I am told, is that it will find it very difficult to replace some components of its equipment for which it has used foreign supplies, which are pretty effectively embargoed. There's a debate among the military people I know about how far that's a serious constraint, because a lot of the Russian armed forces are low-tech and use things that they can actually make or get round. So the impact on the military of this embargo, I suppose that a degradation from the fighting, I'm not discussing that at all, is questionable. The second aspect is, will it affect the Russian economy in the long run and its performance? And the answer for that is quite certain. Yes, of course it will. But the important issue here is the Russian economy has performed miserably since the financial crisis. It's basically a middle-income trap country with 4,000 nuclear warheads. And now it will grow even more slowly, if at all. Mr. Putin doesn't care about this. He doesn't care about economic performance. He's made that very, very clear. He's concerned about land and power within Russia. And so even though he's lost a large part of the young people, and a lot of people are leaving, many of his more advanced industries are going to be damaged, I don't think that's going to affect him either. And that brings me to my basic conclusion, which is I don't think sanctions are going to decide this war, and they never were. What happens in the war will matter. And so I think the more relevant question is that, and how this war develops, which I'm not going to discuss because though I have views, they're professionally worthless. I try to avoid talking in public about things I know nothing about. On the other question, how different is the current situation from the Cold War? I've written a lot on that. I think it's profoundly different. First, while China, of course, has an ideology, and Xi Jinping is more ideological than his predecessors, since, apart from Mao, of course, the Chinese government, in my view, is essentially a nationalist government, which is an extreme version, without an emperor, of the bureaucratic state that the Chinese created before anybody else. It's a centralized bureaucratic state, and given modern technology, they can control this vast space and this vast population, of course, orders of magnitude better than the Chinese empire ever could. So it's not an ideological power, it's more a great power in the Chinese mold. Second, it's incomparably much more economically powerful relative to the West than the Soviet Union ever was, even at its peak. That's obvious. And third, it's incomparably more integrated into the world economy than the Soviet Union ever was, because effectively the Soviet Union hardly was integrated into the world economy or into the institutions of the world economy. So without going into detail about what this means, I think we can safely say, as I indicated in my opening, that the rivalry with China is completely unprecedented for the West. In response to the question that was, I think, one part of the question that Denise Enriquez asked, I would say, and I've written a lot, that at the moment, added all together, the West, which includes the US and its principal allies, remains substantially more powerful on most dimensions than China, but not all. And of course, over time, it is highly plausible, though nothing is certain, and there are things that go wrong, that will change. And my favorite statistic on this, but it's very crude, is if China's GDP per head gets to be a little bit more in real terms than that of the US and Europe, its economy will be as large as those of the US and Europe combined, at least in the middle of this century. Thereafter, the population starts to dwindle a lot, and I won't go into what happens then.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. Now, do you want Rui Schrader, that is a manager and very connected with the entrepreneurial and things that are related to technology? I think it should be interesting, Rui, to have here some question on technology and things like that. You have a lot of experience on that. Okay. Do you want to make some question to Martin on that? We are not listening. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Martin. Thank you for your insights. Well, I want to make a question, not especially regarding technology, but regarding the third parties, the third world, and the countries that are not aligned either with the West, neither with China. In your proposition, you talk a little bit about they are a gamble and try to deal in a neutral part. Of course, for the West, I think it's critical to sustain the attraction from these countries in South Asia, but also in Africa and South America. How would you see the West competing with China for the influence in those regions?
I think that's a superb question, and one that needs a lot of attention. So, as I said, my view is that countries that are neither very closely tied with China, of which there are not that many, there are a few, mainly for profound security reasons. Pakistan, for example. There aren't, most emerging and developing countries are suspicious of the West for completely obvious reasons. They have a memory of our history, even if we don't. And in any case, they're all interested in managing their own problems, right? Which is normal. And when they look at the world, they mostly have very significant economic and other ties with Western countries, but they also have very significant economic and other ties with China. And the latter have been growing very rapidly for many of them. Now, this tends to vary by country and where countries are located and what their resources are. But there are a very large number of developing countries, both big and small, for whom China is already a more important economic partner than the West. And that is bound to increase. These countries, pretty obvious, countries close to China, that's often the case, but also countries that are dominant commodity exporters, like Brazil, it's a pretty obvious example, which fall into that category. And they're indeed developed countries in the Western orbit for whom China is at least economically as important as other Western countries, Australia, for example, or Japan. So the reality is these countries will fight very hard to avoid being forced to make a choice. And that also became clear over the Ukraine-Russia war and the reaction countries took. And my view is that there is nothing we can do about this. We have to make ourselves attractive. And to do that, we have to, I think, follow the Chinese in offering investments on good terms. The Chinese have been very sensible and useful in many cases, no, not all, in doing that. We have to do that. We have to be more helpful when we needed to be in helping them deal with their problems. And I think, for example, our failure to deliver vaccines sooner and to help in dealing with the COVID in many developing and emerging countries was a great mistake. We have to think about the policies of the institutions we still predominantly control, like the World Bank and the IMF. And we need to think about this across the board, because we simply cannot assume that these countries will choose us, because they won't. And that's fine. I think that's not a great problem. There will be plenty of countries that will want close relationships with us for economic reasons, because we have things to offer, and also for security reasons, because they want to balance against China. I mean, pretty obvious. India, for example. So we'll have to be clever, we'll have to be sophisticated, and we cannot make it an either-or proposition, because if we do, I think, we won't like the results. But that's my perspective on this. Many Americans disagree, but I think many Americans really don't know how the rest of the world views them, and I think I do better.
Thank you.
Okay, Martin. Fantastic. We have also here another person that is very engaged in international. That is Mario Franco. He's specialized in Morocco, Africa, and things like that. I don't know, Mario, if you want to make a question to Martin, a brief question, please.
I didn't want to interrupt, but I'm very keen to make one or two questions to Martin.
Yes.
Martin, thank you very much for your articles and for your introduction. I cannot say I'm aligned with everything, but at least I am aligned with one thing you said. And I start by that, and I make 2 or 3 questions or comments.
Yes.
You comment.
Very briefly, yes, please.
The first one is about the concept of West. I think it is very difficult to understand this concept nowadays. For example, in the question of Ukraine and the reinforcement of the European Union, when United Kingdom left the European Union, then there is not really, I was really, 2 months ago, I was really feel a little bit strange when I saw the UK Prime Minister helping or supporting the integration of Ukraine in the European Union, when he was just years ago fighting to left the European Union. Then that's one point. The second point is more on security, and I really will be very pleased if you can comment on these facts, not on what I'm saying, is the question of the submarines with Australia. And when we are talking about the West rivalry with China, and we see even in Europe, even with US and UK, we cannot coordinate with France. And the 2 sectors are fighting to sell submarines. Then the West is not showing a strong position outside with this kind of thing. And the last example is very much follow on what Rui said. I'm very focused now in the North Africa and Middle East. Is one very extreme example is the way how, for example, this week, the IMF is behaving in Tunisia, which was the only left democracy between commas, okay? But which is a result of the lack of action and financial support to the democracies after the Arab Spring, and especially Tunisia. And we left these countries completely alone, and after others, then, of course, it's not, they choose China or West. They are no other way for them, because they are lagging behind, and there is nobody to speak. There is not a strategic vision to integrate, for example, the North Africa in our economic system, in our supply system. Then it's very difficult to understand. I mean, I keep these 3 comments. Sorry, they are trying to be a little bit provocative, but I will be very pleased if you can comment on these topics.
Okay. Can you comment, Martin, a little bit, if you want?
I'll try and do it very, very quickly. I think the question whether there's a West and what it consists of is a perfectly good one. And at a philosophical level, I think the answer is very doubtful. And obviously, these groups of countries have always squabbled like mad. And for much of their history, they were at war with one another. And we have fought more wars, the British have fought more wars with France than I think every other country in the world put together. So this is sort of pretty obvious. I think the answer to the question is and I'm not going to defend my Prime Minister, for God's sake, so I won't even dream of going there. It's an embarrassment of the highest order. The answer is this is a group of countries which, on a good day, share certain interests and values. On a bad day, they're hopeless. On a good day, they share certain interests and values. And in the world that I have defined, it seems to me the demarcation of interests and values that they share are somewhat clearer than they were 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And in some ways are more like they were during the Cold War, but in different ways. So that's the sense in which I would hope there to be a West. If you're asking whether I think this West will survive, I actually suspect not. And the main reason is not from what reasons you suggest, but because of what's going to happen to the US, which I think is in almost mortal political crisis. And that links with the question of security. Obviously, what the British and Americans did to the French in Australia was insane on every possible level. And it's the result of the absolutely absurd nervous breakdown that the British have gone through and the Americans' failure to understand the implications. The French usually don't help, but that's another matter. Will these be resolved in the current situation? That's a very open question. Finally, on help for emerging democracies, I completely concur with your view. I would say, however, and that's perhaps a bit provocative, but you were provocative, so I will be too, that in helping Tunisia, I think, since the IMF was never going to be much use in this because it's not really in its terms of reference, this fell absolutely squarely within the interests, capacities of the EU. So I would say that was a huge opportunity for the EU. It's your southern flank, as it were. And I don't think you should expect the Americans. Anyway, whenever the Americans get involved in the Arab world, they seem to me to commit horrific blunders. So you would do far better to sort it out yourself. And it is the nearer board of the EU. So I encourage you to do so.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, I agree with Martin, but I was not Prime Minister. Sorry.
Okay. I don't know, we have still 10 minutes. Fernando Monteiro, do you want to make a brief question? You have also a lot of experience in management and in international affairs. We are not listening. Okay.
Thank you for this opportunity to hear Martin, and it's very interesting what you have heard, especially the last ideas that who are we? Who is West Europe? And the problem is very, very difficult today because you are fighting for the values of West Europe and the West. But what really are these values today? When we make a scanning of what's happening in USA and in all Europe, that is not a political entity, we see a lot of confusion. And today the big issue that, in my opinion, that we try to be, especially in Europe, politically correct in everything. In education, in national health, there are problems everywhere with different tonalities, but essential as structural problem for all Europe. And perhaps we try not to focus on the structural problem, but give further steps that we are not prepared to. I have the example of the mobility, is one example. We try to be the first in Europe to have electric cars, for instance, in the next 5 or 10 years. Europe was one of the big comparative advantage was what was the car business, for instance, in Europe. We are first in exports. Steel industry is first in workforce, is first in innovation. And all of a sudden we try to be the first of electric thing. That is a big trend and we must follow that. But today we have heavy steps that are imposed by political, not by the customers, not by the manufacturers, not by the distributors, but it's only an example. We have big problems, for instance, with education. We have lack of professors, and we have discussion of bathrooms for transsexuals. So this is why I think today Europe is a bit trying to be big issues, big abstract issues, but not focusing on structural problems. That's why when we say we are fighting for the Western values, I think really we must focus what are these values today. And of course, the war in Ukraine have given us a purpose. And of course, Europe and USA has a lack of purpose. And this purpose has provoked some unity. But this is a big false unity. As you have sold, all of a sudden, everything can disappear. And what I'm clearly afraid of is the war is going to continue. And we are not seeing yet a clear vision where it's going to end. And as time is going on, I think that we are assisting that Europe is going to be more separate on this issue, and not only. USA, as you have told, is a big question mark. Really, USA today, USA and Europe, we tried really to be together, but we never know what's going to be USA in the future. And this is a thing that really worries me. I think that we are today, Ukraine, it was really a good reason in last months that, okay, we can have some unity values, but I think we are today forgetting the essentially and trying to get the impossible today, and we are not focusing on the essential problems. Okay. It's my opinion. That's why the big question, who is the West? Who is the West in the next future?
Martin, do you want to make some comment on this question of values and of difference between Europe?
I think I don't have much to add. Either one has common interests and values or one doesn't. I think that it was pretty clear during the Cold War, at least to us, to me, and Portugal ended up, I think, joining this after the dictatorship, that we had decided on some notion of societies built on democracy and individual liberty under the law. We, along with the ideas of cooperating among ourselves in trade and other ways for mutual prosperity, and to base our relations with the rest of the world, at least to some degree, on those values. And this is how we define ourselves as being different from the Soviets. I think that's true. Now, if you're now saying there are two things, you might be saying that those values and the interests that are associated with economic and others are actually ones we should abandon. Or you are saying, which I would disagree with, but of course anybody can have that view. I suspect you're not saying that. Or you're saying that we've become very confused about whether we really all share those values, and whether at least we share those values enough to form a relationship with the rest of the world built around them, even when we've got the Ukraine-Russia war going on and we've got China, which clearly doesn't show those values. And the answer to that is, my answer to that is, you may be right, we don't. In that case, we will disappear, as many civilizations have before. That, I think, is eminently likely, possibly even probable. I think it would be an enormous pity because I don't like the alternatives. Or we will decide, well, actually, when it comes down to it, these values are enough to form enough agreement for us to be able to work together, even though we continue to disagree on incomparably large number of things within our societies and among them. And this isn't, to me, not a philosophical question. It's ultimately a practical question. Mm-hmm. And I would say, by and large, we seem to share enough. But I'm not at all sure that will last. And when Trump was president, we certainly didn't share very much. There is nothing, however, finally, like having a common enemy, or at least a common rival and competitor to bring people together. And China is certainly that.
Okay, Martin. Now I will pass to Paul Faustino, that is also organizing with me these sessions. Paul, do you want to make also a question to Martin?
Well, thank you very much for your very nice general overview about the international political and economic situation. A very short question. So, some days ago we had a meeting in Russia about the BRICS countries, and some years ago they tried to create a bank to compete with the World Bank. Do you think now they have better conditions and maybe other reasons to create it? To do that now?
Well, as far as I know, they have a BRICS bank. It's, I think, called the New Bank. I can't remember what they call it now. I know the man who runs it, and that was the BRICS bank. And of course, they also have the Asia Infrastructure Bank, AIIB. So there are very substantial banks that have been created largely with Chinese money. And they, as far as I can see, these banks are pretty well run. And they were modeled on a sort of better version of the governance of the Bretton Woods institutions. So they do exist. They're doing things. And I personally supported their creation. I think competition is good. So how can I possibly object to competition from Chinese, well, institutions in which China is the largest single player, but there are also other players. It's the New Development Bank, isn't it? The New Development Bank that they call it.
Yeah.
NDB, yeah.
Okay, that's okay, Paul? Okay.
Thanks very much. That's okay.
To conclude, I think that Denise wants to make a small question, right, Denise? And then we'll
thank you very much for this brilliant section. I've learned a lot, and I would like to make one last question to Martin. And please apologize me for this thing that I'm asking, but I would like also to hear the Dr. Pedro Passos Coelho opinion on this subject, because maybe Martin won't know the Portuguese reality so deeply, because Dr. Pedro Passos Coelho was our Prime Minister in a very difficult time. And I would like to know, how do you see Portugal in this uncertainty times, with all these questions that were raised on this session? We are trying to develop the country based on some aspects, trying to find a strategic common view and so on, a country brand. And there are some options on the alternative energies, green energies, the sea potential, on energy, on new kinds of food, and so on. And tourism also, a country of development and knowledge that started to be more known when there was a big migration on that crisis time, that our talent that immigrated to foreign countries had the positive aspect of catching the attention to our human resources, very qualified. And what should it be the way to follow to not to lose the chance of this money that is coming to the country, these European funds, and this effort on finding a common strategy that keeps together the politicians, the entrepreneurs, the social society, and so on. What should it be the way for a small country like ours, with our potential areas and our weaknesses, on this big world order, on this European new emerging order, on this on all the things that were referred on this section. Okay. And please, if Dr. Pedro Passos Coelho could also add his opinion, I would love to hear him.
We could start eventually with Pedro, and then we pass to Martin. Okay, Martin, and you conclude. Pedro, please.
Thank you.
Well, I'm so interested in the Martin comments that I will be very brief. I think that Denise is right about the opportunities. It's important not to lose the chance of the European funds. That's the first time that we can issue common debt in Europe, and it would be important for the future of the Union that this kind of money could be very well allocated for transformation, economic transformation and social transformation. So I think that it's important. We have a good chance to have good projects in the green energies, in better qualified tourism offer, and so on. But we must manage two ancient problems, I think. First, we have a problem with productivity. The state doesn't help enterprises and peoples to be better at work. We are very complicated. There is not trusted society, and people and the public system is not trusting each other. That's the first problem. It's a political problem, but it's very permanent for the last 2 centuries. The second problem is that transformation is gaining a meaning that cannot be the same for certain ways of doing politics and what we would need in the society. We don't have any kind of transformation of reforms, social, economic, and political reform since, I don't know, the past almost 30 years. The last transformation we could manage was during the Troika time. And as you know, most part of them are reverted. So the problem is almost political, as Martin Wolf said since the beginning. I don't know if we will have the strength, the political strength to change, to spend well the money, to put the state working in a very productive way, and to offer to the entrepreneurs the possibility to put innovation every day, rendering best results. That's not the way we we have done the things for the past years. But hope never dies. So I hope that many people, as Denise, could manage a different prospect in the political society.
Okay, Martin, to conclude.
So I try to avoid questions like this for two reasons, which are linked, but they're fundamentally different. The first is, it is among the stupidest thing a human being can do to advise people who know about 10 orders of magnitude about the question than you do what they ought to do. And in this case, there is no doubt that that is me in relationship to you. Of course, I've visited Portugal and read about Portugal and have some idea about its economic history over centuries. But I think my ability to say anything useful about what should be done now in any detail for which you can be thankful is essentially zero. So it would be very silly for me to do this. The second point I would make is a broader one. I started my career, such as it is, 50 years ago at the World Bank. And I spent my first 10 years of my life, I came from Oxford, and I thought I knew everything, as one does when one's 25. And I went to countries, and some of them were incredibly successful. One of my first visits was to South Korea, and when it was really poor, this was in 1972, yes. And some of them were not. And I realized that the little toolbox that we came with economic ideas were grotesquely inadequate. And I've been thinking about why, and this is a very complicated point, but it perhaps relates directly to what Pedro said, which is, and it's captured beautifully in a book I've just read by a man who's a professor at Oxford called Stefan Derkon. And it's, I can't remember the title, but it's basically, is one I recommended. It's about what makes development work. And his basic conclusion was almost exactly what I understood Pedro to say, which is that if I try, he said, he worked on developing countries throughout his life, to differentiate the ones that have done well from the ones that haven't, the real difference is, do the elites of the country really want it to develop? And do they agree on what development means? And if they do, it will, and if they don't, it won't. And so basically, Britain has made very little economic progress in the last 50 or 60 years. Relatively, it's been in decline, quite obviously. It's been up and down, and that's because basically we don't know what we're doing. And the Koreans did. Now, there I'm taking Korea is the most extreme example in the last 60 years. There's nothing else of a large country that compares. So the question is always, what precisely to do and how is a question that only experts can tell. And I have no idea what your opportunities are. You obviously have very many able people. But a more important question might be whether there is sufficient agreement among the people who matter on what you're trying to do and the determination to do it. I think in the case of the UK, there isn't, and it shows. And in some other countries, the opposite has been true, and they've done quite well, including some of the former Soviet countries. So that's the question for you, and it's only a question that you can answer. And I wish you every success, because it's important for Europe that you succeed. And it's particularly important, given the question I was starting this way, that these painful divisions, which are also economic, between the South and the North of Europe end. And they will only end well if the countries in the South do do better, not much better, just do better. And that, I think, is a crucial thing for the future of Europe.
Okay, Martin. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a great pleasure to have here with you. We hope that we can see you here in Portugal very soon. I think we would like to appreciate that. And have a nice weekend, all of you. Nice holidays. And we are going to go on reading your articles. Your articles are every week very important for us in order to give us some ideas. I think that Mario wanted the...
Yeah, I'm just going to, it's called, okay. I'm just going to put it in the chat.
Okay. The reference
I just found it. It's a good book, interesting book. Okay.
That's a pleasure to have this reference so that...
it's gambling on development, not gambling of development, but Stefan Derkon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Martin, again, thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a great pleasure to have you with us. And we are in touch with your articles, and we hope that soon we can see you in Portugal, okay?
I'd love that. Beautiful country, and I enjoyed it very, very much.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Have a nice weekend for all of us, okay? Thank you. Bye-bye.